you know. Today is November the 12th, 2003 at Comox, British Columbia. My name is Marie Mayne, middle name Elizabeth, named for my grandmother Smith. I've been asked by Ralph Smith, third son of my cousin Joe, who is son of my Uncle Jim and Aunt Bessie. Uncle Jim is one of the children of the subject of this account I'm telling now of your great-grandparents. I want to tell what I know of Ralph's great-grandparents, Elizabeth and George Smith. What I know I learned from my mother and father, Nellie and Bob Smith, when I was a young girl. Elizabeth and George Smith were both born in Dover, England, in the middle of the 1800s. George had siblings. I recall hearing of one brother who, as a young adult, came to Canada and settled in Toronto, Ontario. George was a stonemason. Elizabeth was a gypsy girl. Her family lived on the grounds of the ruins of the Dover Castle on the White Cliffs of Dover. Last thing I was saying was my father, on the other hand, said it was anything but romantic. And it was hard. His life was hard and miserable as a boy. And I've written aside here. Oh. Anyway, my mom told me of the courtship of Elizabeth and George. George, a non-gypsy. It seems that George had to prove his worthiness and manhood by fighting several of the gypsy youths. George was strong, no doubt, from the hard work he had done, or he still did. He was able to conquer all the youths in the bare-knuckle encounters. He was given the hand of Elizabeth in marriage, a ceremony performed by her own father, the head of the clan. Then I tell about the ceremony here. The ceremony was performed by making a tiny cut in the right wrist of each and then tying with a silk scarf the two wrists together so that the blood of one would mingle with the blood of the other. Interesting. What a way to get married. After they were married, they moved into a building on the grounds of the castle, which was the gatehouse. They had 8 children, possibly a 9th who died as a small girl. The children were named Rose, George, Liz, Jim, Bob, Joe, Daisy, and Tom. Nothing fancy about the names, just plain names like that. One of the pleasures of the children on the grounds of the castle, the ruined castle, was playing on an old cannon, which was quite intact and lovely, they thought. I'm sorry about this. It had an inscription, the cannon did, and it said, "Shine me up and keep me clean. I'll carry my ball to Calais Green." It was figured it would shoot across the English Channel all the way to Calais. A nervy cannon. Ralph's brother Dan saw this cannon on a recent visit to Dover. After much searching, he found that the cannon had been moved to a place in a sheltered area in Dover. Interesting about Dan finding that. I'm sorry. These children all went to school. The first 4 achieved their X7th grade, which is equivalent to our grade 8. But when Jim and Bob were in grades 4 and 5, a new rule was instituted in which a child must take a penny every day. George, the father, balked at this and sent Jim and Bob with no penny. They were sent home each day. Must have been heartbreaking for them. George began to rally other people to his cause, and in so doing was considered a troublemaker. People began to blacklist him. As a result, he found it difficult to make a living. He and Elizabeth decided to contact George's brother in Canada and see about moving to Toronto. They did this and arrived in Canada in the winter, early 1900s. I got lots of little extras here. I believe that grandmother Elizabeth took the name Gatehouse as a surname to have proper papers for coming to Canada. I believe gypsies didn't bother to have surnames, and I also think she chose the Gatehouse because of their dwelling. That's interesting, isn't it? Elizabeth Gatehouse sounds quite nice. George's brother met them at Union Station in Toronto and took them to the house he had rented for them. That's at 28 Macaulay Avenue, West Toronto, Ontario. Perhaps it's still there. My grandfather, George, taught all of his sons to be stonemasons, and as they married and had sons, he insisted on teaching them as well. It has stood many of them in good stead. They have been able to make a good living. Ralph also asked me to tell what I know of his grandparents and uncles. I only know that my dad, Bob, and his brother, Jim, who is Ralph's great-grandfather, were loving brothers their entire lives. They even looked alike, although different heights. My Uncle Jim, Ralph's granddad, and Aunt Bessie were a loving couple. They had 4 sons, Jim, Joe, Vic, and Russ. They were all very kind, sweet to me. I loved to visit Aunt Bessie with my mom when I was a girl. Aunt Bessie raised canaries for sale. When Aunt Bessie would encourage them, they would all sing at once. It was beautiful to hear, but very loud. I was closest in age to Russ. We would skate in the winter on the back field rink. He would wear a long pheasant feather in a jaunty cap. I knew he'd always look out for me. My brother Harold was good friends with Ralph's dad, Joe. They hunted together as boys. There are probably lots more stories to tell, but I'll answer any questions, Ralph. That's about the end of it, Ralph. During World War II, Jim joined the Army, and Joe, Ralph's dad, was in the Air Force as a, what was his mechanic? Yeah, mechanic. And Vic became a pilot, and he's very good looking in his uniform. I remember seeing him on the street one time, and I thought, oh boy, there's my cousin. I wish he wasn't a cousin. He looks so good. Anyhow, he went off to war, and he did 30 missions over Germany in a Lancaster as a pilot, and survived all that, so he got the Distinguished Flying Cross. And then the war ended, and they all came home. Thank goodness they all came home. I know that Ralph's grandfather, who's my Uncle Jim, was in the First World War in the cavalry. And all I remember hearing, he was in France and he rode horses, very good with horses, and he drew the cannon behind his horse. And luckily, he came home from war. And my dad was a bombing instructor. He regretted he never left Canada, but he as they told him, you're valuable here, teaching young men how to throw grenades and bombs into trenches. It was for trench warfare. And he achieved the rank of Sergeant Major. And don't know. Oh, Uncle Joe, my Uncle Joe, which is Ralph's great Uncle Joe. He was in the army, and they got us into. He was in Germany. He got as far as Germany before he came back from the war. Thank goodness. I think Uncle George. There was an Uncle George too, and I think he was in the army. But I'm not quite sure about all this, you know. But yeah, I think that's. And Ralph's Uncle Jim, I think he just started to build, like all the young guys were doing, all the young Smith guys were doing, building. And he became a bricklayer, I'm sure, yeah. And that was Jim. And Joe, I think Joe learned the building trade as well. And then came Vic. And I think I mentioned that he went to he was flying hunters into faraway places, and he was in he was flying up at Great Slave Lake when his plane went down and he was drowned. And that was very sad for the family. And Russ, he began to build. I can remember him with a scoop and horse digging out basements. It was really interesting to see him do that. And he was so good with horses, Russ was. And later on, Russ began to deal mainly with horses. He had a rodeo business. Well, I don't know what you call it, a rodeo. He belonged to a rodeo. It was his own rodeo, and he had riding horses in a stable, and he rented out riding horses, took people on trail rides, and but he also was an actor's show, and I believe his first wife, and they had a son. They performed. They performed on these horses, the wife and the little boy as well, and Russ. They were excellent riders, and they did all sorts of tricks, trick riding, and the horses did tricks. And Russ knew how to teach the horses to do the tricks, and they had wonderful costumes. They looked gorgeous, and then I can remember as a girl wanting to ride a horse, and so I thought, oh well, I'll go down to Russ's stables and I'll ride a horse. But he was very busy, so I expected him to take me, just me. But he said, do you mind going with this group? And so I did, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing, and I thought I was going to be dead that day because the horse began to gallop, and I'm hanging on for dear life. I was so happy when the ride was over, and then it would walk, and then it would run, and I just felt like it was bouncing all over the saddle. I was so delighted when the ride was over. I said, Russ, you should have taken me on that ride. I said, I nearly got killed today. And then he, of course, laughed. He said, I'll take you another time when I'm not so busy. And that was my encounter with horses. You know, he could build. He built your house. He built, excuse me. I'm glad that's not being recorded, or is it? Oh, no. Anyway, they all could build, every one of them, and they weren't too happy with their own grandfather, but at the time, because he was a tough taskmaster, they made them carry the hod, which was heavy. I forget how many bricks are in a hod, but quite a few, I think, and they are very heavy, and they have to carry them on their shoulder up a ramp onto the building, or to the bricklayer to lay the brick. Anyway, I think that was horrible. But they all did it, and he insisted they do the hard work, and then they learned to lay the bricks. And they all got pretty darn good. Quite fancy and very good bricklayer. Yeah, all the Smith boys, all the Smith men hunted. They hunted rabbits, and which was a good thing because they kept us supplied with meat, and they also hunted deer. They went to a hunting camp for the deer. But when I was a little girl, I mainly remember the rabbits and jackrabbits. They were, and my mom would make rabbit stew, and sometimes bake a rabbit in the oven. And it was a real treat if they got a cottontail. He was a real tasty rabbit. And I can remember one time my brother brought home a pheasant and a cottontail. And my mother cleaned them and prepared them and put the pheasant in the middle of the cottontail's legs and prepared them for the oven. And that was the most delicious meal I think I ever ate. And but we always had rabbits, rabbit stew and roast rabbit, and you know, that was our main meal during Depression days actually, and it was good we had it. And it was later on that they did the deer hunting and had a deer camp, and went to a deer camp. But I think my brother Harold would tell you more about all that. He's not here, but when you Harold, my brothers were in the war also, Second World War, and they're both in the Navy. And Brother Joe, the oldest one, was on a frigate that was in the North Atlantic, and they saw action in the North Atlantic, and Harold also saw action and was wounded during the war, his leg badly hurt. But he's managing to still walk on that old leg, and he's doing just fine. Next time.